What if you were buried alive as a pharaoh's servant, the retainer sacrifices of Egypt's first dynasty? Give him a name, since history did not leave him one. Nebankh. On the day Egypt's king Jer died, sometime in the early 3rd millennium BCE, Nebankh walked under his own power, or led, or perhaps already past caring, the evidence cannot say which, in a procession moving out from the palace toward a stretch of desert near Abydos. He was one of several hundred people making that same walk that week. Household servants, craftsmen, women of the royal apartments, men who understood how to run a king's estate, all of them chosen, or perhaps informed only at the last moment, that they would not be coming back. Ahead of them, dug well in advance and arranged in matched rows, several hundred pits already waited, each one sized for a single body. Whether Nebankh reached his own already dead, was killed the moment he arrived, or was sealed inside it still breathing, is not something the archaeology can settle. What can be said is that within days of the king's death, every one of those pits held someone who, that same week, had still been alive. No inscription confirms a servant named Nebankh ever existed. He is a reconstruction, assembled entirely from what archaeology has recovered about hundreds of people just like him. Real skeletons, real grave goods, real burial pits, arranged around real royal tombs at a site called el-Qa'ab, near the town of Abydos. For most of the 19th century, nobody understood what those pits meant. That changed in 1899, when a British archaeologist named Flinders Petrie began clearing the sand away from this shattered royal cemetery, and found, inside pit after pit, not treasure, but people, buried at the same moment as the kings beside them, in numbers that, in one case, reached into the hundreds. Petrie had uncovered the physical evidence of a practice Egyptologists would later call retainer sacrifice. The question it raised has never fully gone away. Were people like Nebankh killed and then buried? Or were some of them buried alive? To understand how a man like him ended up walking into that procession in the first place, and why an entire kingdom thought it was normal, the story has to go back nearly 3 centuries earlier, to the moment Egypt became a single state at all. To understand why a king would want dozens or hundreds of people to die alongside him, it helps to understand what Egyptians of this period believed death actually was. The Nile Valley produced an unusually literal vision of the afterlife. It was not a vague spiritual reward. It was a continuation, the same body, the same appetites, the same court, transplanted into another world that ran parallel to this one. Centuries later, the Greek historian Herodotus would write that no people are so religious as the Egyptians. And while he was describing a much later Egypt than the one under discussion here, the instinct he captured was already old by his time. If a king needed bread, beer, linen, and administration in life, the reasoning went, he would need all of it in death, too. Grain and pottery could be packed into a tomb. Furniture could be built for it. But a king's household was not only objects, it was people, cupbearers, craftsmen, women of the royal apartments, men who understood how to run an estate. Somebody, early Egyptian elites decided, had to go with him. This was not unique to Egypt. Similar practices have turned up at Ur in Mesopotamia and among early Chinese dynasties, among other places, suggesting the idea was less a single culture's superstition and more a solution that early state societies kept independently arriving at. Some anthropologists studying these parallel cases have proposed that retainer sacrifice functions as a form of costly signaling, a display so extravagant, so wasteful of skilled labor, that it could only be staged by a ruling family with genuine, overwhelming control over its subjects. A poor chief could not afford to bury 40 craftsmen. A king who could afford it was making that fact impossible to miss. In Egypt's case, the practice appeared early, it appeared briefly, and then it disappeared. Its entire visible span in the archaeological record runs across the First Dynasty, roughly 3,100 to 2,900 BCE, barely 2 centuries, against more than 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization that followed. There is also the Ka to consider, the life force Egyptians believed persisted after death and required ongoing sustenance. A king's Ka did not simply need food and drink left at the tomb entrance. It needed, in the thinking of the earliest dynasts, the full apparatus of kingship intact and functioning on the other side. Egypt did not wait for kings to start practicing something like this. In the centuries just before unification, local rulers buried at Abydos and at Hierakonpolis, another major pre-dynastic center farther south, were already spending scarce resources, imported wine, exotic animals like elephants and baboons, in a few debated cases possibly a human life, to accompany their own dead. The evidence from this earlier period is thin enough that specialists still argue over how much of it counts as genuine sacrifice rather than accompanying death by other means. What is not in serious dispute is the trajectory. The impulse to use death as a display of power was already old by the time Egypt became one kingdom. Unification did not invent that impulse. It just handed it a king large enough and a court large enough to eventually turn it into something on the scale that would take a life like Nebankh's. Sometime around 3,100 BCE, a ruler most Egyptologists identify with the name Narmer, and whom later Egyptian tradition remembered under the name Menes, brought Upper and Lower Egypt under a single crown. The famous Narmer palette, carved with the king smiting a kneeling enemy on one side and inspecting rows of decapitated bodies on the other, is propaganda for exactly this moment, the birth of a state built partly on the visible display of death as an instrument of royal authority. Unification did not just create a bigger Egypt, it created a court large enough and a kingship absolute enough that when the first ruler of this new unified line died, an entire household could plausibly be expected to die with him. It also created for the first time royal funerary architecture on a scale that could physically accommodate the practice. Enormous rectangular mud brick enclosures at Abydos, their walls once standing several meters high, with room around the central burial chamber for row after row of subsidiary pits to be dug, filled, and sealed within days of the king's death. That first ruler is generally identified as Hor-Aha, whose name means roughly the fighting hawk. Aha's tomb complex at el-Qa'ab is surrounded by dozens of subsidiary graves. Estimates from different excavation seasons put the number at somewhere around 40, with one commonly cited figure near 42. Because Aha's tomb was among the first the practice touched, his subsidiary burials also mark the beginning of the archaeological pattern Petrie would spend years excavating: a large royal chamber ringed by smaller, single-occupant pits, each one covered by its own low mound and, in some cases, its own small inscribed marker. Little is known about who these first individuals were, beyond the fact of their burial. Aha's reign also produced one of the earliest known instances of a subsidiary burial containing an animal alongside a human, a detail that fits the wider pattern already visible at pre-dynastic Hierakonpolis, where rare and valuable animals were killed to accompany the elite dead. It is plausible, though nothing more than plausible, that a man belonging to this first generation of sacrificed retainers was close kin to the young man this account calls Nebankh. Service at the first dynasty court tended to run in families. One of the few forms of security a household in this period could pass down. What is known with more confidence is what happened next. The practice did not shrink after Aha. It grew dramatically under the king who followed him. Aha's successor, Jair, ruled Egypt for several decades in the early First Dynasty, and his tomb at Abydos is the largest of the entire dynasty's royal cemetery. It is also the site of retainer sacrifice on a scale nothing before or after would match. Estimates vary depending on how the subsidiary graves are counted. Some Egyptologists cite figures above 500 across Jair's full tomb enclosure, while others, counting only the graves directly associated with retainer burial rather than the wider funerary complex, put the number above 300. Either way, it is by a wide margin the largest mass burial event of the period. Who were these people while the king was still alive? Nebankh, in this account, stands in for what the physical evidence says about all of them. Almost certainly members of the king's personal household, rather than random subjects pulled off the street. The men and women who dressed him, brewed his beer, prepared his meals, managed his estates, and staffed the rituals that surrounded an early dynastic king day to day. Serving a king this closely carried real status in life. Better food, better housing, proximity to power in a society where almost everyone else worked the fields. That same closeness, on the day the king died, appears to be exactly what marked a person for the subsidiary graves. There is no clear evidence in the First Dynasty record of captives or foreigners filling these pits. The people buried around Jair and around the kings before and after him seem overwhelmingly to have been Egyptians who had spent their working lives inside the palace, not outside it. Men, in Nebankh's case, young enough that a wife and an infant son were still waiting for him in the servants' quarters beyond the palace walls. Nothing records that household by name. It is inferred from a demographic pattern. Most of the male skeletons recovered from Jair's tomb enclosure belong to men in their early 20s, precisely the age at which an early dynastic Egyptian man was most likely to already be married and starting a family of his own. Skeletal analysis from these graves has told archaeologists more than the graves themselves ever could. Many of the individuals recovered were male, generally young, in their early 20s, and showed evidence consistent with strangulation. Others showed no trauma at all, which has led some researchers to argue for poisoning, cyanide being one candidate raised in the literature, since certain compounds derived from plants available in the Nile Valley could kill without leaving a mark on bone. This is where the buried alive question becomes genuinely difficult to answer, and where Nebankh's own fate is most uncertain. Petrie, working in an era before forensic archaeology existed as a discipline, assumed, based on the tomb layout, that at least some retainers might have been sealed into their pits while still living, perhaps drugged into unconsciousness first. Later reanalysis of the skeletal evidence has generally shifted the consensus toward death by strangulation or poison, occurring before burial rather than after. The idea of servants smothering under sand while conscious, the version of the story that circulates most widely today, is not what the current bone evidence best supports, though it cannot be fully ruled out for every individual across every reign. The physical arrangement of the graves is itself informative. They run in long, disciplined rows on the north and east sides of the royal enclosure, each pit roughly the same size, each originally capped with its own small mud brick vault and a limestone stela bearing a name. This was not chaos, it was logistics. An event that killed and buried several hundred people within what was likely a matter of days required advanced planning. Pits dug ahead of time, materials stockpiled, a chain of officials organized to carry it out once the king's death was announced. Whatever else it was, Djer's funeral was one of the largest coordinated undertakings the young Egyptian state had yet attempted. What the graves at Djer's tomb do make clear is who was expected to die. Some of the burials belonged to household staff, others based on the objects buried with them: small tools, cosmetic palettes, fine pottery imported from the Levant, appear to have held minor administrative or craft roles, the kind of people a king's estate could not run without. A handful of subsidiary graves elsewhere in the First Dynasty cemetery include stelae naming individual occupants, and, in a few cases, gesturing toward their function at court. Though attaching specific named titles to specific graves at Djer's tomb remains an area where the evidence is fragmentary rather than settled. What almost none of the graves suggest is that these were prisoners of war or social outsiders. The people buried around Djer appear, as best the evidence allows archaeologists to judge, to have belonged to the king's own household. The very people closest to him in life were the ones closest to him in death. This is the day the account opened on. What is worth adding now, with the fuller picture in view, is how little of it was improvised. No First Dynasty text describes the funeral itself, so the sequence is reconstructed partly from later Egyptian funerary parallels, and partly from what the graves themselves imply. The king's body, already undergoing whatever preservation methods this early period could manage, carried by boat and by land to Abydos, followed by the procession of household members. The pits waiting for them had been dug well ahead of time, in matched rows, which means Djer's household did not spontaneously decide, in a single afternoon of grief, to kill several hundred of its own members. It executed a plan that had almost certainly existed, at least in outline, before the king ever fell ill. Nebankh's morning of mixing beer and folding linen was, in other words, always going to end this way, for as long as he served this particular king. Djer's son and successor, Djet, continued the practice at a reduced but still substantial scale. His tomb enclosure at Abydos is ringed by roughly 174 subsidiary graves, a steep drop from his father's numbers, but still a mass event by any other standard of the ancient world. Had Nebankh's infant son survived to adulthood and followed his father into palace service, plausible since positions at court in this period tended to stay inside families, he would have come of age under Djet, serving a household that, if his luck ran out the same way his father's had, was already being emptied out at less than half the scale of Djer's reign. Djet's successor was not a king in the conventional sense. Mernith, most likely his widow, ruled Egypt, either as regent for a young son or, by some readings of the evidence, as a monarch in her own right. During a period when the next heir, Den, was too young to take the throne alone. Mernith received a full royal tomb at Abydos, complete with the two large stone stelae that marked a king's grave, and her funerary complex included its own subsidiary burials, roughly 41 individuals surrounding her, of which specialists judge around 33 to be probable retainer sacrifices rather than incidental burials. That a woman ruling as regent received the same funerary treatment as a king sacrifice included, says something important about how the office of kingship, not merely the gender of the person holding it, was what triggered the practice. Merneith's status has never been entirely settled among Egyptologists. Her name appears without the additional royal titulary a king would normally carry, and later Egyptian king lists mostly omit her, which has led some scholars to treat her as a powerful regent rather than a ruler in her own right. Others point to the scale of her tomb and its subsidiary burials, matching that of the kings on either side of her, as evidence she was treated, in practice, as a monarch, regardless of what later scribes chose to record. Either reading leaves the same fact standing. Whoever controlled the machinery of the first dynasty state could command the same funerary retinue a king could, queen or not. Merneith's son ruled Egypt for an unusually long reign, one long enough that some later king lists remember him as a source of considerable innovation in royal ceremony. His tomb complex is surrounded by a much larger total number of subsidiary graves than his mother's, around 133. Yet of these, only about 83 are now judged likely retainer sacrifices, the rest belonging to later intrusive burials, or serving different funerary functions entirely. Compared with Djer's peak, this already represents a meaningful drop, even before adjusting for the mixed nature of the site. The practice that had once consumed hundreds of lives in a single funeral was, by Den's reign, consuming considerably fewer. If that hypothetical son of Nebankh's had a son of his own, the grandson would have been reaching working age just as Den's long reign settled in. Old enough, in principle, to be counted among the roughly 83 probable retainer sacrifices tied to Den's tomb. Though by now, the odds of that fate were considerably better than they had been for his grandfather. The kings who followed Den, Anajib and Semerkhet among them, left a thinner and more damaged archaeological record at Abydos, in part because Semerkhet appears to have deliberately erased or reused parts of Anajib's monuments, a sign of political tension inside the royal family, rather than any change in belief about the afterlife. Semerkhet's own tomb is unusually small and poorly built compared with his predecessors, and ancient tradition remembered his reign badly. The later Turin king list, compiled well over 1,000 years afterward, attaches a note to his name suggesting some kind of calamity occurred under him, though the text is damaged and its exact meaning is disputed. Whatever instability gripped the royal family in these middle reigns, it did not revive the scale of sacrifice seen under Djer. What subsidiary burial evidence does survive from Anajib's and Semerkhet's reigns points in the same direction Den's did. Fewer retainers, smaller enclosures, a practice contracting rather than expanding. The final ruler of the first dynasty, el-Qa'ab, presided over what the archaeological record shows as the practice's last gasp. His tomb is surrounded by only around 26 probable retainer burials, a fraction of Djer's numbers from barely more than a century earlier. After el-Qa'ab's reign ends, sometime close to 2890 BCE, the pattern of subsidiary graves around a royal tomb simply stops appearing in the Egyptian archaeological record. His death was followed by a brief and confusing succession crisis. The names of one or two shadowy rulers, sometimes read as Sneferka, and a figure known only from a sarek showing a bird, survive on a handful of objects, but not in later king lists, suggesting a contested transition into the second dynasty. No king firmly attested from the second dynasty onward is known to have been buried with a retinue of sacrificed retainers. The practice that had once claimed hundreds of lives at a single funeral vanishes from the evidence within a few generations of its peak. Whether a great-grandson of Nebankh's lived long enough to see that disappearance is, like everything else about this family, invented for the sake of the account. But if he did, he would have grown old inside the palace, instead of being carried out of it in a pit the size of a single body. That, more than any statistic, is what the fall from Jer's hundreds to Ka's 26 actually meant for a household like the one this account has followed. Not an abstract trend line, but the difference between one generation and the next, between service ending in a grave beside the king and service simply ending. Why it ended is not stated anywhere in surviving texts. The first dynasty predates connected historical narrative in Egypt, and no scribe left behind an explanation. Some Egyptologists point to practical pressure. An early state still building its administrative machinery could not keep bleeding away trained household staff, craftsmen, and officials every time a king died, especially as reigns grew longer and royal households grew larger and more specialized. Others point to a shift already visible by Den's reign, when subsidiary burial numbers had dropped even as the tomb enclosures themselves grew more elaborate. A possible sign that Egyptians were beginning to trust that objects, images, and inscriptions could serve a dead king almost as well as an actual human being could. A king no longer needed to take his household's lives. He increasingly needed only to take their likenesses. That shift, once it started, did not reverse. But it also did not happen overnight. For several centuries after Ka's reign, Egyptians filled the gap left by retainer sacrifice with a range of partial solutions rather than a single new one. Old Kingdom tombs of high officials, built centuries later during the age of the Great Pyramids, are covered in relief carvings of servants brewing beer, herding cattle, and weaving linen, scenes meant to magically function for the tomb owner in the next world without costing a single actual life. Some also include a false door, a carved stone panel through which the tomb owner's spirit was believed able to pass to receive offerings. None of this required killing anyone. Middle Kingdom tomb models go a step further. Small painted wooden figures of bakers, brewers, and boatmen discovered by the dozen in tombs like that of the official Meketra at Thebes. Only by the Middle Kingdom proper, roughly 2050 to 1650 BCE, well over 800 years after Ka, does a new object appear that formalizes the substitution completely. The shabti figure, a small mummiform statuette inscribed with a spell compelling it to answer on behalf of its owner and perform labor in the afterlife. The word shabti is generally translated as answerer. By the New Kingdom, a wealthy Egyptian might be buried with dozens of these figures, sometimes one for every day of the year, plus overseers to direct them. An entire symbolic workforce standing in for what, more than 1,000 years earlier, would have been living human beings led into a tomb pit to die alongside their king. The practice itself was forgotten almost as completely as the individuals who died in it, buried under sand and later under the weight of a much longer and more famous Egyptian history. The pyramids, Tutankhamun, Cleopatra, that overshadowed the obscure First Dynasty entirely. It took Petrie's excavations at el-Qa'ab between 1899 and 1903 to bring the subsidiary graves back into view, and decades more before archaeologists like Walter Bryan Emery, working at the parallel elite cemetery of Saqqara in the mid-20th century, filled in a fuller picture of just how widespread and organized retainer sacrifice had been in Egypt's first century and a half as a unified state. Even that picture remains incomplete. The relationship between the royal tombs at Abydos and the enormous mud brick mastabas Emery found at Saqqara is still argued over. Whether the Abydos tombs were the true burial places of the kings and Saqqara held their courtiers, or whether the arrangement ran the other way, is a debate that has never been fully settled. What forensic archaeology has managed to add, particularly in the decades since Petrie's own crude excavation methods gave way to modern osteological analysis, is a clearer, if still partial, answer to the question that opened this account. Petrie himself worked quickly, by later standards almost carelessly, recording burials in notebooks and moving on within a single field season to cover ground modern teams would spend years on. Much of what he removed from the ground was never fully documented by the standards archaeologists apply today. The evidence recovered and properly analyzed since, using tools Petrie never had, isotope analysis to track diet and geographic origin, closer examination of bone surfaces for the faint marks strangulation can leave on the hyoid bone and cervical vertebrae, increasingly favors death before burial for most of Jer's retainers, strangulation for some, poison for others, rather than live burial in the literal sense. But the sample of skeletal material recovered and properly analyzed remains small relative to the number of graves originally recorded, many of which were disturbed by later looting or by Petrie's own excavation before more careful methods existed. New excavation seasons at Abydos, including ongoing work by the German Archaeological Institute at the wider Royal Cemetery, continue on a modest scale even now. Each fresh skeleton pulled from the sand carries the chance of overturning what specialists currently believe. Modern Egypt still stands on the ground where this happened. The town nearest el-Qa'ab, also called Abydos, remains a pilgrimage site, not for the forgotten kings of the First Dynasty, whose names most visitors have never heard, but for the great temple of Seti I, built more than 16 centuries later, a reminder of how thoroughly this early chapter of Egyptian history was eclipsed by what came after it. Tour buses stop for the painted chapels of Seti's temple, and rarely continue the extra distance out into the low desert where the actual founders of the Egyptian state are buried. Few of the millions who visit Egypt each year, and few even of the Egyptians living a short drive from el-Qa'ab today, know that the ground nearby once absorbed one of the largest single episodes of ritual killing in the ancient world. Yet the practice uncovered at el-Qa'ab remains one of the starkest windows archaeology has into what kingship actually meant at the moment Egypt first became a single state. An office so absolute that a king's household was assumed to belong to him even past the boundary of death. Until, within a few centuries, the Egyptians themselves apparently decided that a carved image, a painted relief, or a small answering statuette could do the job just as well, and that the dead no longer needed to take the living down with them. Somewhere among the several hundred sets of remains Petrie pulled from the sand around Jer's tomb in 1899, anonymous, uncatalogued by name, distinguishable from one another mostly by which row they happened to lie in, is, in the loosest possible sense, Nebankh. Not because any single skeleton can be matched to that name. None can. Every detail attached to him in this account was assembled from people very much like whichever one he actually was. The graves at Abydos are still there, quiet rectangular pits in the desert, catalogued now and mostly emptied of their contents by excavators long since finished with them. It remains an open question exactly how many of the people once inside them understood, in their final hours, what was about to happen to them. And it is a question the sand at el-Qa'ab has not finished answering.